welcome to Wargamer Shut Up and Jam Gaiden, where we're going to talk about primarily Warmachine this time. You can catch us Monday to Thursday on YouTube, as we're releasing these episodically, and then on Friday you can either watch the full YouTube thing, or you can get us in podcast form on soundcloud.com/WSUJ Gaiden, and yeah, fancy. But I'm Steve, this is Mike.
You can't even let me say my own name?
You can say your own name.
I'm Mike. This is Steve.
Do you have a nickname?
Not right now.
Okay. And today we're going to talk about some new news that's happening and shaking with, Privateer Press.
Get used to it.
Yeah, well, until Mark III actually drops and, we run into things to make up and tell you, we'll probably be doing a lot of Warmachine content.
Yeah.
So, and we have a couple of shows planned that are going to be pretty interesting, I think. So, in the Insider on the 27th, that'll be the first thing that we kind of break down and talk about. I'll list out some of the changes and we'll kind of go over them. First things first, in multi-list events, there are no more character restrictions.
Yeah, it was the whole Insider was mostly about Steamroller and organized play.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty huge bomb to drop.
Well, exactly. Their rationale behind it was that you're heavily favoring certain factions and characters over others, because some you wouldn't want to take in multiple lists, and they're really good in the list that you take them in. And then some you just kind of need in all cases, but you can't because of the rule. And it just didn't make a lot of sense for the tournament structure and having a competitive environment. So. I
mean, they took the character restrictions were initially put in place to de-homogenize lists to make that, so you weren't taking too much of your power from a powerful solo or whatever.
Yeah.
So you actually have to build different lists to compensate for not having them. I like the way they've taken sort of a multi-pronged approach to this, where they've tried to make every unit and warlock warcaster more unique, so that there's going to be more differentiation in lists inherently. And people were the initial complaint they thought of on the Insider was well, now won't we just see Banelord Tartarus in every list? It's you could, but maybe they don't want to anymore.
Yeah.
So that indicates to me that they've toned down on the power level of some of the must include solos too.
Yeah. Well, I know that. I know that they've toned down on a lot of things. One thing that kind of gets me about the Steamroller format, though, is I wonder why they still do it. They're still having the multi-list format rather than doing here's a single list with a sideboard and and in that sideboard maybe you have a caster swap, right? They kind of expanding on the ADR idea.
Yeah, I mean, I think that both have their merits. I think that having two lists makes it a clearer thing for your opponent to pick between. So it makes it a better game of sort of bluffing into it. It does create list chicken right now, which is the problem.
Well, exactly. I think that if you had the one list, you have to make an all-comers list more or less, and you can have a sideboard for stuff that that you're weak to. Maybe you can't incorporate everything necessarily, but it just seems like that would be a better system than the list chicken existing at all.
I do think that I'm more inclined to give them a little bit more slack on this, because they're changing the whole rule structure. And I mean, Steamroller is something that gets updated year to year. So it's possible that they'll go with this and then maybe reevaluate it down the road. Maybe it is better to have a single list with a specialist ADR sort of thing. And then they can still change that in the future without having to update the entire edition again.
That's true.
So it's just reducing the amount of change that people have to deal with all at once.
Fair enough. I mean, I think that either way, removing the character restrictions is nice, because let's say you're a newer player just getting into the tournament scene. You only have access to so many models. Well, now you can actually play in the tournament just like everybody else. Maybe you're a bit of a disadvantage because you're going to come across hard counters, or maybe not hard counters, but counters.
Yeah, or in a similar vein, or in Midwinter, if he's not changed too much, is one of your only tools that you own against infantry, against clumped low armor infantry. Then you can play him in both lists now.
Yeah, exactly.
If that's your only option.
And so I mean, I think it makes the tournaments a little more accessible. At the same time, I think that if you end up being a hardcore tournament player, you're going to end up with options for everything, or you'll end up with a ridiculous collection like most of us.
My optimal view of this is that hopefully, despite character restrictions not being a thing, you won't see the same characters in every list.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I was talking to Bryce about this, actually. We were talking about how they keep talking about how everything is super well balanced and everything can be an option and all of this good stuff. And that sounds fantastic. I am a little bit skeptical because of the game. There's so many models. There's so many things to balance against. It would take a long time. I doubt that they could have possibly nailed balance on even after 3 years of development. But maybe like they know what they're doing probably more than I do. I would hope, because obviously I haven't designed any games or don't know what the hell I'm talking about really. But it does. For the problem ends up being like when that meta does establish, what steps can they possibly take to adjust that, right? Like we've seen a lot of Band-Aid fixes recently, so
they mentioned they actually have a strategy in place to deal with like overpowered models in the same Insider.
That's true, but they didn't mention like what that means.
Yeah, we have no idea what that is. I mean, some people were suggesting it's could just be like, version numbers on the cards, so you can actually have updated physical cards for models. They have shown in the past year that they're not afraid to errata models, although that might have just been because Mark III was coming and they were okay with sort of playing around with things before then.
I think that having like versioning on the cards is a good idea. I think that being able to patch the game basically as we go on and have like a evolving meta is super important. But at the same time, when you have all your cards and like you're ready to go, you're ready to play, and your stuff just happens to be wrong, it feels not great. So
it does. And I mean, in addition, like you still don't really want to nerf models that people own. So, I mean, again, this comes down to the steamroller thing too. Like if it becomes a huge problem, they can re-implement character restrictions if they want, or they could be more specific with it. I'm just curious to see what their solution actually is.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm sure that it's been really well thought out. I just don't know what that means yet. They've mentioned a couple of things interesting about terrain. So first off, we're going to be seeing more of it.
Woo!
So they said roughly you're going to see from 5 to 7 pieces of terrain. Will be increasing to 6 to 8 in tournament formats. Our experience with this has typically been like 4 pieces of terrain, maybe 5. Like the problem with Warmachine Mark II was that terrain kind of just got in the way. Like it didn't really feel like it added a lot to the game.
I disagree. I think that people, they have this idea that they don't want to be fighting the terrain, they want to be fighting their opponent. But the thing is that a lot of tournament boards weren't really set up well to make decisions based around the terrain. And in addition, a lot of factions had very unequal benefits and detriments from using terrain. I'm not just talking about Legion, but like Circle has a lot of Pathfinder. Like,
I wonder if that's necessarily a bad thing, though. I mean, like you want some differentiation in terms of like what you can do.
Absolutely, I don't think it's a bad thing necessarily, but I feel like all factions need some way to play around terrain.
Yeah, that's true.
They should have it.
One thing that they did mention is that there are now going to be lower terrain placement restrictions. So. Like before, you had to have a certain distance between terrain pieces and a certain distance from your objectives, and like it made this board state which was really kind of static in a lot of cases.
Primarily, the one they talk about is that you've got obstructions, right? Like you can now just toss an obstruction in a zone, which you couldn't do before. And I mean, some people will say, "Oh, it's annoying. There's an obstruction." Now you have to play around it. Like both you and your opponent have to make decisions based on that.
That's true, and I mean, it also means that terrain placement, like at the start of the game, is going to be pretty important. Now, I wonder if there's going to be rules to determine how terrain's supposed to be placed, or if you both kind of just fill up the board and then kind of agree that that's okay, or what?
I would assume that in like a tournament setting, you still have the TO making terrain and making sure that it's similar on all tables.
See, I hope that if that's the case, that TOs typically will make things asymmetrical. Then
that's the intent. Like that's been the intent with Mark II as well.
Yeah, you just didn't see it a whole lot.
No, because there's a lot of bad TOs. No offense to the good TOs, there are good TOs. I'm not saying that all of you are bad, but there's a lot of bad ones.
And for those of you that may not be like big into the tournament scene or into like super competitive games, the reason why you want to have an asymmetrical kind of board state is. Because then the person who chooses what side they go on, as well as whoever has to deploy first, that decision matters.
Yeah.
And you're having to make preemptive decisions based on how you want that game to shape.
Now Warmachine had already adjusted the steamroller rules to make more sense. They had a compensation in that, like, the first player deployed 3 inches less onto the board to compensate for first turn advantage, but with symmetrical terrain rather. That's still not enough of a disadvantage to make it not always the right idea to go first in a lot of cases.
Yeah, that's true.
I guess always is the wrong word, but most often.
Yeah, that's fair. Well, and that's the thing. It's like, especially when you're dealing with these objectives and like zone-specific and area-specific objectives, you being ahead means that you get to them first, which puts you at a huge advantage.
Well, exactly. It forces your opponent to react. I do like that they added one important terrain restriction in that it has to be a certain distance from the board edge.
Oh.
Which means you can't just have, I've got 50 pieces of terrain on the board, but they're little walls around the outside. So now we can just have our no holds barred dick measuring contest in the center of the table.
Fair. One thing I do like, actually, another change was that there's no more towing into terrain features. So and this was elaborated on in the forums a little bit, in that it's no longer a thing. Terrain features like forests and clouds, they only provide their benefit to models completely within that terrain feature, and that also applies to hills.
Yeah.
So now the thing that's interesting about that is, first off, they didn't define zones as zones as terrain.
Right.
So you could probably still tow into a zone.
Yes, people they confirmed that towing into a zone is still a thing.
Okay.
In addition, zones are still the same size as they were in Steamroller 2015, which is a point of convenience because a lot of people have like templates made out for it. Which I think is nice because they're also good size zones, like 12-inch diameter circle and a 12x6 or nice little. Well,
and I never felt like the size of the objectives was a problem. Like I never felt like, that was too small or too big, or I couldn't get models off of it. Sometimes if somebody swarmed like a zone, you'd have to put significant effort into clearing it out. But like it never was a problem. I feel like that was a good design choice. One thing they mentioned. Well, so let me rewind a second here. The terrain, not being able to tow into a zone means that larger terrain features can exist now. So for people like me, I like having a scenic board. Like I like having cool, funky hills and cliffs and buildings and stuff like that. Because for me, it's a visual experience, and I'm not really a super competitive player anyway. But I think that all adds to it. But in Mark II, you were really incentivized for having smaller terrain features, really like specific size things. So like, for example, our forest, because you could tow into the forest, if you had a giant forest, the amount of area that actually covers, including the tow-in kind of area, is massive.
I mean, so I think you're right, but I think you're explaining it backwards to me anyway.
Okay.
I think that because you could tow in, terrain features could be smaller and still have as much of an impact on the battlefield. I think like an equivalent terrain feature now, like you have say just like a 3-inch circular forest. Now to be as relevant, that forest has to be like substantially larger to have the same amount of space to accommodate models.
Well, exactly, and I mean, although it's a small change in a way, for the people who like scenic kind of stuff. You can now design those things and build them and have them, and then also our in our case our forests are particularly relevant now.
And also, if you happen to play Legion, this is also a buff for you because
it's the same really.
Now there's more forest to block line of sight, not more clouds, but there's more forest on the table to block line of sight to everyone but you.
I guess that's fair. Another thing that they mentioned is that for like rough terrain, anything that slows your movement, you will still slow your movement as soon as you touch it. So if you tow in the zone, you're still slowed. Sorry.
There's no point in doing that anymore.
Yeah, exactly. So like if you're moving into something that slows you down, you still get slowed down. It's not after you get the base all the way in, because I know some people are like, well, I could just walk through the rough terrain like this around the outside. No, that's stupid.
Yeah, no, of course not. Doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that the terrain changes are pretty sweet. I think functionally, assuming people have relevant sized terrain for the new rules, it's pretty much the same, except maybe more line of sight blocking stuff.
I mean, I think there's going to be more terrain, and it's going to be in more relevant places. I think it's going to create more interesting games. Mm-hmm. Because again, that argument of like, I don't want to fight the terrain, I want to fight my opponent, but like, I think that's a stupid argument. No offense to people who make it, you might not all be stupid. I think that argument is stupid. Just because you and your opponent are essentially having a battle of wits at this strategy game. Like, whoever can maneuver around the terrain better is going to be the better player.
Yeah.
So you're actually still demonstrating mastery over the game and your opponent, even if what you're doing is overcoming the terrain to better destroy them.
It's doing that one extra thing that sets you apart from your opponent. So.
And hey, this is a skill to replace pre-measuring.
The other thing that they mentioned is the new Rumble rules, which is interesting because specifically for people starting the game, where you don't necessarily have like a giant 4x4 table. Even if you haven't just started the game, like it's less than 3x3, right? It's a 30 inch by 30 inch. 30 inch by 30 inch area is what they suggest. Although they mention that's not necessarily exact. One other thing that so for those of you that don't know, the new Rumble rules have you playing on a play space that's 30 by 30 inches, and when you deploy your advanced deploy first.
Only your advanced deploy.
Sorry. And basically everything else walks onto the board. So it's kind of like an artificially...
Yeah.
It basically sets you a turn ahead, and it's kind of like an artificially larger play space than it actually exists.
Their intent was to say, like, this is like starting a game at the bottom of turn 3.
Yeah, fair enough. And that makes a lot of sense. So I think that'll be actually an interesting game mode to explore, just because really the first couple turns in every game was just like set up, walk forward. So this... For like filming and for battle reports and stuff like that, just makes things expedited.
I mean, don't get me wrong; it's not replacing the standard 4x4 experience, because there is a lot of strategy involved in maneuvering your forces properly based on what your opponent's deployment is, based on what your opponent's done with your forces. And there's options there.
Yeah.
And I think that some of those are lost with the Rumble, but I don't think that all of them are. And I think the Rumble just lets you play a much faster game on a greater variety of surfaces.
I think that there's one missed opportunity with the new Rumble rules. The new starter boxes come with a playmat that is not 30 by 30. It's like 24 by 24.
Is it really?
Yeah. Like if you look at the the way I figured this out is I looked at the mat. I looked at the 18-inch ruler they have on there, and you kind of extrapolate the size.
Interesting.
It is not 30 inches. There's no way.
That's pretty ridiculous.
And I'm like, okay, it's geared around just the starter battle boxes, but I think that's like a really, would have been a really awesome thing if they would have done that.
Yeah, that's kind of weird. Oh well.
So I mean that's fine. You just kind of define 30 by 30 inches. That's okay. But like that would have been nice.
Also, 30 by 30 is kind of a weird. Like it's less than 3 feet, but more than 2. It's like 2.
Yeah, I mean you think
2.5.
I'm surprised they didn't go like 36, just to if only to be compatible with like a lot of the game mats people have.
Yeah.
But I mean, who knows how popular the Rumble format's going to be. I think that we're going to try it out. I think it'll be interesting.
Absolutely.
We might even play the battle box against each other in some capacity. I'm not committing to all of them because we know how that's gone.
It's cool that they have Rumble specific scenarios too in the book, though.
That's true. So that's pretty much it on the first Insider.
I'm gonna enjoy playing Rumble with like Tooth and Claw Mangled Metal, if those still exist.
That's the thing. I wonder if the Rumble rules kind of replace Tooth and Claw Mangled Metal kind of.
I think they're different axes. I think Rumble is like more of a terrain and like placement thing, whereas Mangled Metal and Tooth and Claw were always like list building restrictions.
I think one thing that's interesting about the Rumble rules specifically is, and with the battle boxes as well, I think the games will actually be fun. Like I think at a small size, the games will be fun.
Yeah, I think so.
Whereas some games they don't really open up until you hit like a certain model quantity.
Yeah.
So that'll be interesting. I also hope that they have some way of looking at like scenarios for in between battle box and like full size games. So like let's say, I realize they may not do this, and this might just be wishful thinking, but it might be nice to have like what would be the equivalent, like 30-point scenarios.
I guess
just for like newer players to not feel like they're left out.
I suppose.
Come check out the Connection Games and Comics. We have the largest selection of Warmachine and Horde miniatures in the Lower Mainland. Warmachine Wednesdays and Sundays, with tables and terrain to play your game.